Bonjour tout le monde. Désolé pour le retard. Nous allons commencer le débat stratégique. Euh, Ce débat stratégique a l'interprétation simultanée. Donc, vous pouvez choisir en bas votre langue, en français ou en anglais. Vous pouvez communiquer par chat si vous avez des commentaires avec les parents. Je laisse Fabricia prendre la parole.
Merci Narit et bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Je m'appelle Fabricia Devigne, je suis coordinatrice de l'initiative Priorité à l'égalité ou Gender at the Center Initiative au sein de l'Institut international de la planification de l'éducation de l'UNESCO et suis basée à Dakar au bureau Afrique de l'Institut. Je suis heureuse d'animer ce débat aujourd'hui qui a comme titre « Assurer une éducation de qualité aux filles pendant le Covid-19 ». Est-ce une priorité illusoire? Alors, sans plus tarder, je laisse la parole à Paul Couster, qui est notre directeur par intérim de l'Institut, pour quelques mots introductifs. À toi la parole, Paul.
Merci beaucoup Fabricia, je ne serai pas trop long et je vais peut-être parler en anglais pour qu'il y ait une alternance. So, welcome to all participants. It's great to see a very good attendance to this to the strategic debate of today. As you know, we have held this strategic debate as a tradition at IIEP, and we've been going online together with in-person presence. But increasingly, we know that we can reach a wider audience through this platform, and we are glad that you could join today. On today's topic, it won't be long, but we've been all caught by bad surprise with the extent of this pandemic. And each agency or each member state or each education system had to react. And it was good to be prepared in some ways. For the UN system, there was all sectors respond to COVID-19, and IIEP within UNESCO has been the pen holder for the UN Secretary General policy brief on COVID-19 education during COVID-19 and beyond. Yeah, it was launched last August. You can Google it on the UN website, and you could see that already working together with sister agency, you know, the whole of UNESCO, but UNHCR, Rome, Geneva, and other institutions. We've had a large part devoted to the specific impact on girls' education and long-lasting. And each agency brought, you know, the way they prepared themselves, and we had two ways to prepare at IIEP. Nobody is prepared to set something, but we could build on our existing work on crisis-sensitive planning, which is an approach to have capacities for risk management in the Ministry of Education, coordination and communication plans already existing that you can tap upon, and always have the equity issue because that's the first impact of crisis. So we've worked also at country level, like in Burkina Faso, on mainstreaming gender approach. We have worked with, we have one panelist from UNHCR. We have been developing jointly a training course. We add gender dimensions and so on, work with refugees and including, you know, refugees themselves in the planning process. And with the funding from SIDA, Swedish agency, we have the specific impact of crisis, all crisis on girls' education in Mauritania and Chad. So we're coming with lessons learned, and all this, Fabricia is based in Dakar, and she's running the platform that is a consequence of the G7 decision for the Gender at the Center initiative. And we try to gather all expertise to, in particular in Africa. So this is where we are speaking from at IIEP, but today we want to complement this approach with other approach, and it's especially exciting to see in the program how, you know, we can already learn lesson on do priority are in competition with each other? What's happened when there is a big crisis on priority gender, which has been on the agenda for long? And there are risks and there are consequences and bad consequences, and we have probably also opportunities, shifting norms and shifting approach that can, learn the hard way sometimes lessons from what's happening. So without further ado, we probably, I think now, Fabricia will go deeper into what we want to achieve today together with you. And again, it's an honor for IIEP to host this strategic debate, which is, how the network of partners we work with can, we can put it together and learn lessons and go further and try to mitigate and to prevent the impact on girls' education of such crises. Fabricia, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, for these words, and thank you also for reminding us of the surprising turn of events of this global pandemic. Yes, it's a crisis, as you said, and we've tried to bring a multi-sectoral approach, bringing together diverse expertise, and also to apply lessons learned from previous crises. And you said that, yeah, there are risks, but also opportunities with shifting norms. And you're right to emphasize on networking and also partnerships. So thank you for these words. And I put the link of the policy brief in the chat, so that you can read it. Thank you, thank you, Paul, for these words. So I'm switching into French. Donc, nous encourageons, comme Narit l'a dit tout à l'heure, toutes les personnes qui nous écoutent à poser vos questions directement dans le chat. On aura des moments spécifiques à l'issue notamment du thème 2. J'ouvrirai le débat aux panélistes, et aussi du thème 3. Vous aurez l'occasion de poser des questions, soit directement dans le chat, soit en levant la main. Et certains et certaines l'ont déjà fait, mais nous encourageons toutes les personnes qui nous écoutent à indiquer leur nom, leur fonction et aussi leur lieu de travail dans le chat. Ce sera plus facile après pour soit entrer en contact avec vous, soit pour tout simplement identifier qui est dans la salle virtuelle. Donc voilà, donc sans plus tarder, nous allons commencer notre webinaire. Donc, prioriser l'éducation des filles pendant le Covid-19. Pourquoi se concentrer sur cet aspect, et en particulier, pourquoi spécifiquement sur les normes de genre dans l'éducation en temps de crise?
In education in times of crisis? Well, the famous French philosopher and feminist Simone de Beauvoir, in her book The Second Sex, said that with a religious, economic, or political crisis, women's rights can always be challenged. These rights are can never be taken for granted. They always have to be fought for. And this quote has shown how right she was throughout all of the crises, whereas their environmental, health crisis, political crisis, economic crisis. According to UNESCO's estimates, to get back to the topic of education, 132 million girls in the world are not in school, 52 million in Africa are not in school, and many more are confronted with educational challenges. In conflict countries, girls have twice more chances of not being in school than other girls. The current health crisis has reinforced these inequalities. UNESCO estimates that between 11 to 20 million girls and young women in low-income or medium-income countries may leave schools or not have access to school this year due to the economic impact of the crisis. COVID has had a negative impact on health, on girls' welfare, and in addition to the loss of learning due to the long-term shutting of school and to the limited access to remote learning opportunities, many may not go back to school once those reopen. Pregnant girls in certain cases may be discouraged from going back to school and or be stigmatized and therefore not want to go back to school. COVID and school closures have also amplified the responsibilities of many girls in terms of housework and care, reducing available time for study. Some research shows that the impact of violence against women and girls has increased during the crisis, endangering their health, their safety, and their welfare. And we've seen that during the Ebola crisis from 2014 to 2016 in West Africa, and due to quarantine and school closures, women have been more subject to sexual exploitation and violence. School closures have also been connected to an increase in teenage pregnancies. In the past few years, progress has been made in terms of girls' access to school. Their education has triggered a lot of attention, and it's seen as a priority for governments, for donors, and for international organizations. However, during the COVID crisis and throughout the examples I've mentioned, girls tend to be the major losers, and the achievements tend to erase themselves, especially in terms of gender norms. So the debate today deals with gender norms and how they are affected by the crisis or crises. We'll ask ourselves how progress made in changing gender norms can be protected in times of crisis, and in this context, how we can ensure that girls' education remains a real priority. Now, what happens in countries that are undergoing multiple crises, and how is it possible to prioritize in such a context? In order to debate all this, we have around the virtual table experts on the issue who are going to confront various perspectives and complementary perspectives as well. We are going to welcome Rachel Mian-Jangone, who is a demographer and an economist and who has over 20 years of experience in several countries at various levels. She's been a country director of UN Women in Mali and Cameroon, and then humanitarian advisor in West Africa for the same organization before being the deputy director of in Haiti. She's now Director of Regional Influencing Partnerships and Business Development in West and Central Africa for Plan International. We also have Nicole Gesno, who's Deputy Director and Chief of Operation at the Embassy of Canada in Senegal since July 2018. She has over 30 years experience in diplomacy, development cooperation, and humanitarian assistance, and she has covered the 5 continents in the field and at headquarters, especially with the Canadian International Development Agency, which is now called Canadian Global Affairs, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the OECD. We also have Rachel Marcus,
Social Inclusion Program. Rachel has led evidence reviews on non-formal education programs to shift gender norms, gender and youth livelihoods development, gender equality in formal education, protection and child migrants, youth civic and political participation, and effective integration of anti-poverty and child protection programs. She is a lead technical advisor for the Align platform, which brings together research and innovation to challenge discriminatory and harmful gender norms, and has undertaken various training assignments on social and gender norms. She also co-leads the evidence synthesis workstream for the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Program. We have also Charlotte Berquin, qui est à la tête de l'UNICEF.
We have Charlotte Berquin. Charlotte Berquin is the education officer for UNHCR for Western Central Africa for their regional office. She has experience in community protection of children, focusing on the inclusion of vulnerable populations. She co-coordinates the Gender and Inclusion for Education group, which aims to increase equity in education in West and Central Africa using the expertise of member organizations in gender equity and inclusive education in the region. So we really have
nous
quite a broad diversity of participants. Perhaps Chad is going to join us, but we have a few connection issues there. So Mr. Yusuf Ahmad Tahir is probably going to join us along the way if connection allows. Now, without further ado, we are going to start with our first speaker, Rachel Jango-Mian. She's the Regional Director of Plan International. Now, Rachel, could you tell me what is the impact that the pandemic has had on girls' education, and especially in your fields of intervention? How has the crisis changed, or how will it change the way in which your institution is working in the area of girls' education? Rachel, you have the floor.
Bonjour, chers participants.
Thank you, Fabrizia. Hello to all participants and welcome. We often say that educating a girl is educating a whole nation. We all know that girls' education has a multiplying effect on all aspects of life, from health to decent employment to responsibility positions. And it also leads to a decrease in female genital mutilation and poor outcomes in children's health. So girls' education is the cornerstone for the 17 SDGs. Plan International firmly believes this, and this is the cornerstone of our interventions for girls' equality throughout the world, and especially in West and Central Africa. As Fabrice indicated in his introduction, progress was being made in the field of education, but the COVID crisis has hit hard with the closure of schools around the world, and especially in West and Central Africa, which we're talking about today. Research carried out by Plan International throughout the world, and especially in this area, has emphasized the impact of COVID-19 on girls' education. What we've observed is that girls and young women are going to be further excluded from the educational system, as you've mentioned, due to increasing poverty in households and choices that are going to be made by parents, as was the case in previous crises, with the Ebola crisis, for instance. Statistics and projections by UNESCO mean that 11 to 20 million girls might be excluded when schools reopen, which is going to increase the number of 28 girls who are at risk of being out of school. And that was already bad before the COVID crisis. Due to the closure of schools, this has increased the risk of domestic violence, early pregnancy. A report from UN Women has called gender-based violence as the ghost pandemic generated by COVID-19, with several impacts on different aspects of women's lives. Now, before COVID-19, 10 to 30 women of school dropout was due to gender issues. Many girls were married before 18, 76% for countries like Niger, where for over 40 years, Plan International has carried out interventions with the communities and the government to meet those challenges. Distance learning was set up with almost all countries, but this has worsened the gap between rich and poor, girls and boys, urban and rural, to do with education. The reduction of investment in education, similar to all other sectors around the world, is going to mean that progress is going to decrease and worsen disparity in education. Fabrizia, dear participant, better than myself and who better than girls can talk about the problems brought by COVID-19. So I'd like to ask you to watch a video that sums up how girls have suffered from COVID due to the pandemic. So we can visualize girls' testimonies in West and Central Africa on how COVID-19 has impacted their lives through the 14 countries that Plan International covers in that part of the world. Thank you.
Les défis auxquels nous sommes confrontés actuellement dans la
The
société,
challenges that we're facing in society are huge,
les filles sont victimes d'assez de
and
problèmes
girls are the
dans une
victims,
période de
the primary
confinement.
victims of
Là,
all
on
of
se
these
trouve
problems
dans
to do
une
with
période de
lockdown,
pandémie où
etc.
les filles sont
And in
plus
times of
exposées.
pandemics, girls are in more danger.
It's really hard to me because I'm not in school for now. So I stay at home and play with my little brothers and sisters. I cook, sweep my yard, wash dishes in hot water.
It was in the news that one boy, which is a sibling, had impregnated 3 of his sisters at home because of the lockdown.
Ce retard que nous avons eu dans le cursus scolaire a, disons, freiné l'élan de certaines jeunes filles pour aller à l'école. Elles sont plus aussi enthousiasmées pour aller à l'école.
Now, most educational institutions have channeled their way of teaching to technological means. But some girls that find themselves in the rural areas don't have access to internet connection, or they didn't have the resource to get data to facilitate this process.
Grâce à Dieu, avec cette nouvelle vie, on a appris à survivre et à aller de l'avant.
On a réalisé des émissions interactives dans ces zones encore reculées, qui passaient en langue nationale, tout ça pour nous permettre de sensibiliser.
They are collaborating with all stakeholders, being the Ministry of Gender and other NGOs to do face-to-face education on how to utilize their time well in this COVID-19 era.
We want to ask Plan International to continue funding our project as we reach out to many other young girls across the country.
On aimerait que Plan puisse être plus aux côtés des jeunes pour pouvoir ouvrir et apporter des opportunités qui vont nous permettre de continuer à étudier dans un environnement sain et sécurisé.
Create a training center that girls who are dropped from school will go and get some knowledge that even if they are not in the formal school area, they will be on the other side learning that they will be able to support themselves economically.
Merci beaucoup. Écoutons les filles et
Thank
les
you
jeunes.
very much for listening to girls and the young women in this videos. We can see the challenges that they have to face and that the community has to face to overcome the challenges due to COVID-19, above and beyond the challenges we already had in Western and Central Africa for equal rights for girls and young women, in particular, those who are most marginalized, such as those living with disabilities or living in conflict zones. Plan International is fighting alongside humanitarian assistance actors for quality education, which is free, and that is our priority. And we need funding to meet challenges at all levels. So our advocacy provides techniques for governments to take into account the specificities of girls' education in their response to COVID-19 and beyond in all countries, and all the initiatives of Gender at the Center in Niger and beyond with partners such as UNESCO, UNICEF, Farway, etc., to maintain investment in education. Plan International invests in technological innovations and digitalization of teaching to reduce technological gaps between girls and boys. And for example, in one of the programs that we've implemented in Mali, this is the Youth Channel phone, which was received rewards for internationally, so that girls can return or stay in school. And we have several initiatives for this. Intensification to fight against domestic violence, gender violence, early weddings, early pregnancies, We've set up prevention platforms and helplines in Benin, for example, and we have campaigns in all of these countries for girls in school to reach out to parents and communities to make schools safe places for girls and so that classes can reopen. So to conclude this part of my intervention, I would say that COVID-19 is calling upon the entire world to reach out to others for solidarity and for a multi-sectorial approach, putting humans at the heart of our strategies. Plan international, for us, equity and gender equality can only work if we take into account girls' educations. And this is what we believe in, especially for the 14 countries in Central and Western Africa. We need to make education of girls a priority for the thousands of girls who have been excluded from education. I will stop here for BTA for this first part. Thank you very much. And I'm here for any questions. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel, for this very inspiring talk. As you said, education has to serve as a catalyst and also has a multiplying effect for advancing the rights of children and girls to accelerate gender equality and for all aspects of life with health, jobs, responsibilities. Indeed, this pandemic, as we said earlier, has made everything worse. Increases in inequality, new forms of learning have emerged, including distance learning, which can be an opportunity, but it can also strengthen gaps between boys and girls, between the poorest families and the wealthiest families in terms of access to technology. In the video, there were also many inspiring testimonials from girls who have become the main caregivers. You can see how tired they are and the resources they lack, and also the impact of COVID on their education, of course. And these young people need opportunities to be able to progress. Talked about the most marginalized girls, especially those with disabilities, and the fact that we need a really intersectorial approach. And we also need to invest in innovative technical solutions. This comes back to what we said earlier about distance learning and also the digital gender gaps. We really need a multi-sectorial approach with full solidarity. So thank you very much for your inspiring talk. And we really wanted a programmed approach, what's going on with communities, with girls benefiting from your programs. You also talked about a crisis taking on many forms, and I will now give the floor to Charlotte Berquin from UNHCR to have a look at what's going on with internally displaced people who have been forced to leave their homes, and those who are most marginalized. How has girls' education been impacted? And what is UNHCR continuing to do in order to give priority to education for girls despite competing priorities? Thank you very much, Charlotte Berquin, for being here with us. You have the floor to tell us about the UNHCR in West and Central Africa. Thank you very much, Fabricia. Can you see the slides? Yes. Wonderful. Thank you very much for giving me the floor and for inviting me to take part in this debate today. And I wanted to congratulate Rachel for her intervention. It's highly relevant, and the video was wonderful, very touching. So I won't come back to what Rachel already covered in terms of the impact of COVID on education in West and Central Africa. This is a region where already educational systems are suffering from a lack of funds, from many hurdles, and then recurrent crises, humanitarian crises, internally displaced people, conflicts, all of the troubles in this region that we're familiar with. And Michelle, I think, has already given us a good overview of the impact of school closures had on situations which are already difficult for young girls in this region, and which has done away with all the progress we've made over the past few years for gender equality. And it's even truer for people who have been displaced. So I say displaced, but this actually covers a multifaceted reality, because among those that you have refugees, but also internally displaced people, asylum seekers, as well as apatrides. So with these populations, refugee children and internally displaced children, where school rates are already much lower than those who are still at home, of course, the impact of COVID has been even more terrible. You have a few figures here on the screen just to give you an idea. This isn't only for Central and Western Africa, this is at world level, but you can see that in terms of access to education, there is a huge gap between refugees and non-refugees, and the gap widens the more you progress in terms of scholarity. So 63% in primary school, whereas it's 91% overall, and it's only 24% of refugees in secondary school, and only 3% of refugees in higher education. So in terms of higher education, if you consider Western and Central Africa, it's no longer 3%, but only 1% of refugees who have access to higher education. Refugees who already are in a very precarious situation, where it's very difficult to get an education, are even more terribly impacted by the pandemic, because for most of them, they have no access to distance learning, which was set up during school closures, because they weren't included in the response plans at national level, or because they have no tools, they have no means, they have no internet connections to access distance learning. And for girls, there's an additional hurdle. So for refugees, it's difficult. For refugee girls, it's even more difficult. Rachel explained very well that the interpreter apologizes, the speaker has frozen. There's a problem with the connection.
Elle a coupé.
Rachel, we've lost you. Charlotte, we've lost you. Charlotte, can you hear us? She seems to have lost her connection.
Alors, on va essayer de la connecter.
Okay, I'll try to reach out to her. We apologize for our technical glitch. Another one of the technical problems due to COVID-19. Exactly. We all know the hazards. So we'll try to get in touch with her.
On va essayer de la contacter, mais en attendant, on a
So
peut-être
we've
déjà
tried to reach out to her, but in the meantime, maybe we could take some questions for Rachel. So maybe we can answer those while we wait for this problem to be resolved. So there are several questions in the chat.
Elle est revenue.
Ah, she's back.
D'accord, très bien. Charlotte, est-ce que tu nous entends?
Charlotte, can you hear us?
On a eu une coupure d'électricité subite
Sorry.
du bureau et le générateur a mis du
The
temps à se mettre en place.
our electricity was cut off very suddenly, and our generator took some time to kick in. Sorry. Okay, so you were presenting some figures.
Voilà, les chiffres sur l'éducation des réfugiés et on était aux
On the
filles
education of
des
refugees
barrières supplémentaires.
and the fact that girls have to face additional hurdles. I'm very sorry for that interruption. So now I'm on my laptop. Can you see the slides?
Super.
On entend bien.
Super.
Wonderful.
Donc, je reprends.
As I was saying,
Je disais que Rachel avait bien expliqué comment
Rachel explained that there are hurdles in this region to the education of girls, especially for the most marginalized populations, such as refugees. The gaps in access to education, so here between refugees and non-refugees, and also depending on gender. And these gaps for refugees can partially be explained by the cost, but also the fact that girls have to take care of other tasks, domestic tasks usually, especially girls with disabilities and girls who are refugees and have disabilities is even more terrible. There's just additional layers in the difficulties they have to face. If you're a girl and you're a refugee and you have disabilities and you're a young mother, all of this is just compounded and makes their situation ever more complicated. So Rachel talked about forced marriages in this region, in Central and Western Africa, in 11 countries where the earliest marriages are highest, 7 are in Central and Western Africa. So 7 out of 11 countries where the rates are highest for young marriages. And of course, as we saw during the pandemic, this has accelerated, especially in displaced populations, for whom marrying off the girls can actually be a way of protecting them, which has led to difficulties in protecting these girls. That's the paradox, because as Rachel said as well, there's a lot of gender violence, which has only increased with schools closing. So UNHCR carried out a study at the end of last year on a digital inclusion and the digital needs in displaced people in 3 countries in West and Central Africa. So in Mali, Niger, and Côte d'Ivoire. And this showed us that there's still inequality in access, which is already very limited, of displaced people. So access to digital tools and communication, for example, telephones and internet. So we saw, for example, in access to cell phones, only 66% of women in these three countries have access to a cell phone, as compared to 87% of men.
L'accès à Internet, puisque seulement la moitié, c'est le double d'hommes qui ont accès à Internet par rapport à la proportion de femmes déplacées.
And this doubles for men. And then the same is true for accessing internet. But in addition to having a difficulty accessing education, refugees have also mostly been excluded from distance learning set up when schools were closed. And so this means that for an entire period, there has been no learning whatsoever, no education, and it's even more difficult to return to school after that. And several studies have shown, and this study here shows about 20 million girls for the age to go to secondary school will not be able to return to school after the pandemic, based on the experience of Ebola in Nigeria and Sierra Leone in 2014-2015. As far as refugee girls go, it's over half of all refugee girls who went to secondary school before the pandemic who will probably not be able to go back to school after the pandemic.
Pour les pays où le taux de scolarisation
Now,
des
for
filles
countries where
à 10%,
girls' enrollment rate was less than 10%, we consider that all refugee girls are at risk of leaving school following the pandemic. So this is a more than frightening prediction for the generations to come. Now, in terms of response, just to talk about the programmatic side of things. As for the HCR, the response to the COVID pandemic has been an emergency within an emergency. So generally speaking, the HCR's response is also within a dynamic of emergency for displaced population. And not only that, because when you talk about education, you can't talk about only emergency situations, because often displaced populations spend, on average, all of their school years in host countries. So it's not all emergencies. You have to have a more long-term perspective aligned with SDGs, which Rachel was talking about at the beginning of her presentation. In all her interventions, the HCR tries to prioritize the specific needs of the various categories of vulnerable populations. That's the case for attention to the specific needs of girls, boys, disabled people, etc. Now, as for the specific education interventions, specific attention was drawn to enabling displaced and refugee girls to have access to remote learning programs during this period. For example, in Cameroon, Burkina Faso, and Mali, the HCR has handed out thousands of solar-powered radios so that girls may have access to the radio programs that were broadcast by the government, with specific attention to distribution to girls. There have also been awareness-raising programs within communities to ensure that girls have access to the equipment and have access to these programs. Specific attention was also drawn to retention of female teachers within education system. We know that the lack of female teachers in Western Central Africa is a barrier to access to education of young girls. And also these female teachers were doubly impacted by the pandemic, because in addition to work due to the family, they had additional work because they had to take care of sick people in the community, of students, etc. So the HCR has tried to pay more teachers in those areas with specific concern for female teachers. Also attention to the reopening of schools and to everything that's been done around building back better. It was mentioned everywhere, this idea of building back better. So what do we do in order to do that, especially to foster girls' education? I think that everything that's been done and the light that was shed on the need to increase access to infrastructure and wash infrastructure has been a positive part of the pandemic. It's really shed light on the burning need within schools, which also has a repercussion on girls' enrollments, especially at secondary school levels. So all of the interventions in this area, so here you can see on the picture an example of intervention that was led in a refugee camp in Chad. All of the schools were equipped with latrines, making sure that these were separate from boys' latrines, making sure that the environments were secure. You all know the programmatic detail, but the idea is to make sure that all of the interventions on water, hygiene, and sanitation, with specific attention on girls, especially teenage girls in secondary school, well, we hope all that's going to continue, and that is just one entry point to support the enrollment of teenage girls. Two last points before I finish. I also think that it's very important to focus on systematic disaggregation of data by gender, age, disability, etc. I think this is something that has been improved during the pandemic, and we hope it will continue. That was the case for HCR, systematically in back-to-school programs and back-to-school campaigns. We've made sure that all of the data were disaggregated by gender, age, and disability to make sure that we have a really specific and precise idea of girls' situation when they go back to school. And according to this image, we can develop adapted programs. Now, I'd like to finish with another example for the reopening of schools. This is everything to do on fighting gender-based violence in school and around school. Now, we know that this is often a barrier to girls' education. And so we've really used this dynamic of going back to school to launch a major prevention campaign through SMS and also handing out prevention booklets. You can see a few illustrations there on the screen. This is all available online on a platform, as well as the study on connectivity, which I mentioned earlier. I'll put the link in the chat and you can have access to all of these resources. Now, the idea is to raise awareness amongst the educational community, parents, children themselves, to gender-based violence in the school environment, but also how best to prevent them and respond to them. I'll finish here, and apologies for the technical problem earlier. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Thank you, Charlotte, for this presentation and for these very specific examples on the HCR's interventions, on the solutions that have been brought and recommended, implemented, and also for all this information on the situation of displaced populations in West Africa. You mentioned the way in which the West and Central Africa region has already undergone numerous crises. And you've talked about the way in which the COVID crisis has exacerbated further existing challenges and inequalities. All of the challenges that were mentioned earlier by Rachel has impacted displaced populations even more. You've also mentioned that for the majority of those people, the majority were not included in the national response plans. You've also talked about a really relevant aspect, which is access to technology. Rachel mentioned that as well, but this comes in particularly sharp focus in the context of forced displacement. Now, you've mentioned the situation of girls and the way in which girls were most affected. You've talked about global access of refugee populations to education, and that aspect was really quite interesting. You've talked about the specific situation of girls and all of the challenges, all of the barriers that girls face. These are existing challenges and obstacles in normal context, but in this particularly difficult context, it comes in particularly sharp focus. Now, I'd like to finish by mentioning a very important element, which is the need to have disaggregated data, data that's disaggregated by age, gender, and disability. This data needs to be intersectional so that you can look at all different forms of discrimination, and this is particularly relevant. Now we're going to shift things around a bit. We have a few questions, and I'd like to respond to these questions that the audience would like to ask. We have a question from Uganda.
It's much more difficult for girls to engage in home learning, even if they have access to it, because of their responsibilities and the risks of defilement. What's the solution? Donc, cette question est pour Rachel ou
so this question is for either Rachel or Charlotte.
Est-ce que je répète la question?
Do you want me to repeat the question? I think we can start answering this question. I've noted 3 or 4 more in the chat. So I'm going to try to gather all of the responses. There's a question also about why invest in girls' education. There's a question about Niger. Do we think that COVID-19 is the main reason for girls leaving school, being out of school in Niger? And there's also a question about the digital gap. Before COVID-19, we knew that internet penetration in sub-Saharan African countries was very low. Internet penetration in sub-Saharan Africa was also very disparate between girls and boys, rich and poor, urban and rural environments. So COVID-19, with the use of technology as the main way of teaching children after school closures and after lockdown, has triggered an increase in the digital divide, which was already in place in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's somebody in Kenya who asked a question. I think there are opportunities because countries can advance their technologies. They have advanced their technology and what they can put in place to make sure that there's a better connection. 10 years back, I remember Dr. Mio, my husband, many people in the world of education know him. So Dr. Mio wrote a thesis on making sure that technology becomes a key aspect in teaching at primary and secondary education, especially in Côte d'Ivoire and in the rest of Africa. But it seemed like a utopia at the time. Now, COVID-19 has enabled states to look at the situation and set up strategic plans to implement strategies to address this issue. Investment in education. So the question is, why invest in girls' education? Well, as I said earlier, girls' education has an impact on all of the SDGs in terms of countries' developments. Health, education, girls' welfare. We're talking about reducing gender inequality. But if we don't invest in a qualitative way in girls' education, making sure that girls' educational rights are guaranteed, then we reduce the circle of inequality in the future. We will ensure that the fight that we're leading to reduce gender inequality is going to be the same that we have tomorrow. And according to certain studies, we'll need more than 100 to 150 years to reduce gender inequalities around the world, and even more time in countries such as ours. Now, to take the case of Niger, very briefly, before COVID-19, education and literacy in Niger did not have specific statistics for girls. So there were around 20 to 30% and sometimes 5% in education in certain areas. The causes were that they were married with children. Now we know that education, in areas where education was used as a key factor as a strategy, it's really had an impact, hence the importance of carrying on with these investments. And this is what Plan International in countries such as Niger, Mali, and Guinea has been doing in over 40 years. We are working in the field with the communities to bring local solutions developed by the communities themselves, not communities that we come up with, but communities based on the realities of these communities. Those that are going to bring about qualitative and quantitative change in what we hope to see in the life of girls and young women for whom we are investing in these various countries in West and Central Africa. I think I will stop here and let Charlotte answer on the issue of refugees. Thank you very much, Rachel, for these very specific elements. We have a question for Charlotte about a figure that you mentioned earlier. You were talking about the 3% of access to higher education amongst displaced population.
Refugee girls. And une question assez intéressante, c'est why is higher education seen as a luxury for refugees? Peut-être avant que tu ne répondes, Charlotte.
Now, before you answer, Charlotte, this is for our listeners. We've talked about why we should invest in girls' education, and we've had some answers from Rachel. Then Nicole Gesneau is going to talk about investing in girls. Then we'll have a debate about how and why we should invest in girls' education, especially in times of COVID. So we will look into this deeper later on for those who are asking these kinds of questions. But now about refugees specifically, Charlotte, would you like to answer the question? I think that saying that we consider higher education as a luxury, unfortunately, is not specific to refugees. Unfortunately, in the region, higher education generally tends to be considered as a luxury, which is unfortunate. I talked about refugees, and I don't know all of the statistics about access to higher education in various West and Central African countries, but unfortunately, it's still quite low, especially for girls. Our perspective is to say that there is no level of education that should be seen as a luxury. That shouldn't be the case for the general population, and similarly, it shouldn't be the case for the refugee population. I'm not going to remind you that education is a right for all children, including refugee children, and that in addition to being a right, it is an essential tool for the protection of refugee children who are already submitted to many protection risks due to their family situation, to the environment, to the context of their displacement. So this is the best tool for their protection from the earliest age. And the older you get, well, it's the best tool to become resilient, to become self-sufficient, and to include yourself from a socioeconomic standpoint in the host society. So that was just to provide the framework. Now, secondly, what do we do in order to increase those percentages? Well, there's a number of actions carried out by HCR, but also by its partners. So, for example, there is a program which is the DAFI program. It's a university bursary scholarship program for refugee students in their host countries, in their asylum countries, and based on excellency criteria school results, they can obtain complete funding for the first cycle of higher education, that is up until BA or licence in the French system. Now, within the framework of the allotment of these scholarship, which is done annually, the HCR systematically tries to attribute at least 50% of its scholarships to young girls. Now, unfortunately, there are countries where we are not managing to do that because there are not enough qualified girls who are applying to get these scholarships. So the question is, why do we not get enough qualified refugee girls applying for these scholarships? Well, if you look at what's happening just beforehand at secondary school level, you can see that there's a weak proportion of girls who are leaving secondary school. So the focus for action is not just based on higher education. If we want to increase the proportion of refugee girls who have access to higher education, the work has to be done upstream in primary school and especially secondary school, because it tends to be at secondary school that there's more of a gap and that the gender gap becomes deeper. If you have an equivalence of girls and boys, refugee girls and boys who finish secondary school, finishing secondary school really shows a gap in between refugee and non-refugee children, but also between boys and girls amidst the refugee population. This is why in my intervention, I focused on all of the interventions that are done at secondary school level, because if we want to sustainably increase access to higher education, we have to, first of all, focus on the gap with access and with completing secondary school for girls, especially refugee girls.
Merci Charlotte pour cet
Thank you,
éclairage.
Charlotte. We have a few questions in the chat. We won't necessarily have time to answer them all now, but we are jotting them down and we'll come back to them if we can later on. I just wanted to highlight an interesting comment in the chat.
Many young people who could succeed at university are drawn to economic activity instead, mining, fishing, agriculture, and we need advocacy about the longer term benefits. Donc ça me semblait intéressant en fait de le souligner. Et puis un dernier mot en fait pour clore cette petite séquence.
To close the sequence here. So what you said earlier, Charlotte, on the fact that the UNHCR is working in emergency situations, and it's important to be able to take a broader view. And it's true there, between emergencies and development, they all tie in together, and that's why it's very important to have resilience programs. And earlier you talked about the fact that refugees weren't necessarily taken into account for these programs, and so that should be done for long-term improvements. So I will stop here and we'll come back to the questions. We are noting them down, but let's move on to the next theme, and we'll try to have a broader perspective. So we've now looked at what's going on the ground by Plan International and by the UNHCR. So we'll now hear some different perspectives with Rachel Marcus.
We'll now take a step back and listen to Rachel on what happens to gender norms in education during crisis. So Rachel, how have gender norms affected education in the pandemic, and how do you interpret this in terms of gender norms, and what recommendations would you put forward to planners and policymakers? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Fabricia, and thank you to Rachel and Charlotte for those excellent presentations. Thank you, Norit, for the slide. Yeah, please, could you put it back? So I'm really going to focus on a few particular norms and how they have affected girls' access to education and learning opportunities during the pandemic. As the previous speakers have mentioned, there are a lot of estimates of very large numbers of girls who may not be able to return to school, who haven't returned to school, who have experienced forced marriages and teenage pregnancies. Often these remain currently at the level of estimates, and we don't have very much hard data at the moment as to how girls' education has been affected, how boys' education has been affected. And from there, then we have to deduce how norms have affected the kind of outcomes that we see. There are also an increasing number of qualitative studies that also give some insights into the role of norms. And so I'll be mentioning some of those as well. So the key norms that I wanted to focus on in this presentation are firstly norms around whose education is prioritized. So who can make the best use of education, or who needs it most. And we know that, you know, in many contexts, girls' education has historically not been a priority, that if a family is short of funds and can only send certain children, then it's very often the boys. Over time, that has been shifting in some contexts, with some families starting to look at which children maybe have more aptitude for education, which who are more interested, who seem to be doing better. But in the main, you know, still there's a bias towards boys, particularly in low-income households, low-income countries and rural areas. And we really see the intersection of location, household income, disability, and so on. So, for example, you know, some countries in the Western Central Africa region, even before the pandemic, girls in the poorest households in the rural areas were only getting about 2 years of education. Often it's parents and community members whose norms are the most important in this. But it's also sometimes norms among girls themselves, girls and young people themselves, you know, their own preferences, a perception maybe that education is not very useful for them, that everyone leaves around this time. And so, you know, they will go along with what's the norm in the community, what's the accepted thing for them to do. And these norms about whose education is prioritized affect both education during the pandemic, accessing remote education, and the return to school. So in terms of accessing remote education, others have already mentioned the issue of digital divides. And I think often when we talk about digital divides, we think about smartphones, computers, and so on. And you know, we know there's data on gender biases in access to those, but there's also a digital divide in relation to, say, use of radios and TV. Girls are often the ones with the least power in the household to be able to ask to listen to an educational broadcast or watch an educational broadcast, and younger girls in particular. So older siblings might be much more able to say, no, my broadcasts are more important. I'm taking my exam soon. You know, you're only, you know, grade 2, grade 3, you don't need to listen to it, you can catch up another time. And yet we know that actually it's the youngest children who in many ways have been most affected, and the learning gaps are greatest for them. You know, a recent study from Kenya that is featured on the UNESCO GEM report blog showed that it's youngest children who have the biggest learning gaps in maths, for example, and it's harder for them to catch up. Also, in relation to being able to access remote education, there's the issue of mobility. In some contexts, remote education is not something that you can do at home if you have to go out and access Wi-Fi and internet somewhere. And that's particularly a challenge for girls, probably particularly for adolescents who face more constraints on their mobility if it's not seen as appropriate for them to be moving around in their community, for example. Also, in terms of whose education is prioritized, then the question of paying school costs. And during the pandemic, in some contexts, families have faced additional costs. For example, if children have to buy a new mask every day, for example, you know, if they're not allowed to wear reusable ones, if it has to be disposable ones, then that's an additional cost. And a study that one of my colleagues in the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Program led in Ethiopia, that was one of the issues that girls were highlighting as a really significant problem that they faced. We've also seen that in some parts of the world, particularly South Asia, where more boys typically attend private schools and girls attend government schools, there's been increased dropout of boys from those schools because parents can no longer afford to pay those costs anymore. So moving to some of the other intersecting norms, and what I wanted to show with this diagram as well is that they all intersect with each other to produce the outcomes that we're seeing. There are different gendered expectations on girls and boys in terms of how they'll be contributing to their household. Some other speakers and also some of the participants in the chat have highlighted the often quite severe disparities between expectations on girls and boys to undertake household work. Domestic chores of different kinds, and how that affects time for study, how it changes perceptions about whether girls can go back once school restarts, or if they can go and access remote education, or if they're on a shift system of attending some weeks and not other weeks. If things are particularly busy that week, then the norms are that they need to get that household work done, and maybe too bad if they miss their week at school. That's not to say also that families don't also prioritize in a lot of cases and really try their best, but at the same time these norms are circulating and affect what different children's access to education. Also norms around financial contributions to the household. There's some evidence that older boys, adolescent boys in particular, are particularly affected by these. So, the norm of the male breadwinner that can create pressure on adolescent boys to drop out and help earn income for the household. There's evidence from Pakistan, for example, among boys who were in school, but also were combining it with work. In September 2020, around 9% of boys responded that work was a main activity for them. So that's paid work. That had risen to 15% by February. So that's really quite a significant increase in only a few months. And this is a study done by CG Dev, and it's on their website. Comparing that with girls, only 1% of girls said that work was a main activity other than schooling in the same age group. So that really highlights that disparity in that particular context. But it's not the same everywhere. So in other contexts, we've seen that there's pressure on girls to contribute to household income too, and that can lead to, for example, more girls being involved in transactional sex and then into early pregnancy and early marriage. So that's the other norm that I really wanted to focus on. Again, it's something that other speakers have already mentioned, and again has come up quite a lot in the chat. So first of all, norms around early marriage, where it's seen as a generally desirable thing, and then enhanced by economic pressures, but also a situation where it's not really seen as it's nobody's best choice, but families are making those decisions because of the economic impacts of COVID and giving up on their daughter's education because of that. I think it's also important to recognize that it's not just the parents who and a guardian's decision. Also, for adolescent girls, if they're out of school, especially for a long time, and not much prospect of going back, then, as one girl in the study I mentioned in Ethiopia said, well, it's better to get married than sit idle at home with no school. And increasingly for adolescents, if they're out of school for a long time, among their peers, there can be a norm to move on to the next life stage, to become an adult, to get married, to get pregnant, and really that their childhood and their education is behind them. We know also that teenage pregnancy rose a lot after the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, because of girls being out of school, being more exposed to men in their community because of a norm, again, that said that large sexual relationships between older men and younger girls, particularly to support them financially, are acceptable. And in contexts where those sorts of norms continue, then that's another factor leading to increased risk of pregnancy. I mentioned norms around mobility already. As I said, it's about being able to attend school, also being able to access remote learning materials, whether that's a question of going to pick them up or sometimes access Wi-Fi. Again, one of the girls in that study in Ethiopia I mentioned said, I think it's easier for boys to attend distance learning because they can easily go out and get Wi-Fi access, and for girls, much more of a challenge to do so. As everyone has mentioned, these norms don't affect everyone equally. They're felt much more sharply among poor households, and crisis also sharpens discrimination based on other forms of identity, such as affecting children with disabilities. So what are the implications of this? Well, other speakers have already mentioned a number of different solutions. I won't go over the ones that have already been mentioned in any detail, so to focus more a bit on those that haven't so far. Social protection is a really important part of the picture. Whether that's general cash transfers to a household, or if it's cash transfers to specifically enable meeting the costs of schooling. And in some places that could include support for data, which has been used effectively in Morocco, for example. Media campaigns and community dialogues, our colleagues have talked about and shown some lovely images already, so I won't mention those in any detail, but they're hugely important in shifting norms around all sorts of things, whether that's around attending school in general, whether it's around specifically attending after pregnancy, around sharing of chores and so on, to address those household work burdens. I think something we've not mentioned so much so far is the impact of security issues as well, which are so critical for displaced populations, but also really affect girls' mobility elsewhere. And I think, work to challenge norms that perpetuate gender-based violence in the community, and not just gender-based violence, but other forms of violence that make attending school unsafe. For many families, and it's a rational decision not to send their child to school if they're at risk of serious assault or even death while being in places where schools are under attack. So I think that whole part of the picture, and then how it intersects with norms, is something that would be good to give more focus to. Finally, the kinds of measures that are to do with enabling children who've dropped out to come back to school, whether that's through face-to-face visits, through WhatsApp, through other kinds of messaging. All the evidence is if girls have dropped out for more, then those follow-up activities are going to have a disproportionate benefit to girls to enable them to come back in again. And finally, focusing on this issue of lost learning and enabling children to catch up again. And it's so hugely important. It also has an impact on norms, because norms can shift around education, shift quite quickly if people perceive that it's useful and beneficial. If with those kind of catch-up programs, if children are doing well, both boys and girls, then it shifts the perception that it is really worth investing in girls' education. In conclusion, really, I just wanted to reiterate again that sometimes it seems like norms can be timeless and set in stone and not change for a long time, and in crisis. But actually we can see sort of two things happening. One is those norms being reasserted, but sometimes also shifting quite quickly in response to changing conditions. And so I think if we focus also on some of the sort of the material conditions, the social protection, the investment in improving the quality of education, alongside the more specific norm shifting and community empowerment measures that others have talked about, then those are ways that these kind of more root causes of gender inequalities in access to and learning opportunities can be addressed. And so I'll stop there and pass back to Fabricia. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this very enlightening and rich insights, and also to emphasize that gender norms, I mean, you said that it's not easy. I mean, norms are not easy to measure quantitatively in general, and gender norms more specifically. And yeah, thank you also for explaining the different types also of norms in the context of crisis. It was really interesting in terms of norms around who most needs can make best use of education, also the different contribution to household, paid and unpaid. And you talked about the digital divide and also how it affects girls and boys differently. You also mentioned a very important thing about intersectionality and masculinities as well. You talked about the differentiated dimensions of gender inequalities, especially in relation to male and adolescents. And yeah, it was really interesting. And you mentioned something quite innovative in terms of mobility and the fact that, yeah, during this debate, we haven't discussed about the security issues. And I think that this is really important, and especially in terms of COVID. And also, you mentioned the fact that even though data is still emerging, we have to deduce from what we are seeing live, and that we all know that traditionally girls' education has been given lower priority than boys, and I think that this will be a good transition from your point to the next one on investment and prioritization of girls' education. So you have answered a bit, but there is a question in the chat for you, Rachel, on how can girls be given affirmative action to complete their education? For example, support with sanitary supplies or other economic solutions. You have already answered a bit, but maybe you could elaborate more on that and respond to our audience. So how can girls be given affirmative action to complete their education?
Thank you. Yes, a really important question, and also very important to raise that issue around sanitary supplies, which is so much often not discussed, but is a really major barrier for some. I think that, you know, there are lots of countries where there are cash transfers, either aimed at poor households in general, or at specifically at adolescent girls to enable them to stay in school. And I think there are pros and cons of each approach. You know, if there is a very major disparity, a gender disparity, then there's an argument for targeting on girls. But in many countries, you know, poor boys are also very much affected. And there's also a strong argument for, you know, making cash transfers targeted to all poor families rather than singling out girls, which can also provoke a backlash. I think then there are specific questions about how that's targeted and how it's transferred. You know, does it go directly to the girl into her bank account, for example? Does it go to the household? And that's maybe best. That question is probably best resolved at a local level, because it will depend on different cultural patterns about you know, how income is controlled and spent, and also, you know, the practicalities of how school costs have to be paid. You know, is it taking to fund the school at the start of each term, or is it more purchasing uniforms and school, you know, books and other supplies? So that's one part of it. I mean, obviously there's complementary type measures as well that are around enabling adolescents and their households, and also of course for younger children to generate more income, you know, whether that's you know, through different types of economic strengthening intervention, you know, in business and agriculture and job creation and so on, that are maybe a bit outside the scope here. So those are some of them. In terms of sanitary supplies, I think, again, there's different approaches. You know, they're supplying them through school to sort of mass purchasing. There have been lots of innovative sort of community-based efforts to help girls learn to construct pads and also generate social enterprises and small businesses selling them. So those, I think, are some of the approaches, and I'm sure there are others on this call who can add much more on that. So I'll stop now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Maybe some reactions from Charlotte or Rachel in terms of really the investment or the links to the quality education.
Oui, peut-être Fabricia, si tu me permets,
If you'll allow me, Fabrizia, on the last point that was mentioned by Rachel, we've talked a lot about having a long-term approach, but also having an approach on all of the educational curriculum throughout the school career, about having sanitary menstrual hygiene supply, encouraging girls to produce and to have economic resilience through these means is also very interesting. I think that one important solution, one important area in terms of donor investment is to see how we could make a connection between education, socioeconomic insertion, self-sufficiency, and the resilience of women and girls, especially in situations of crisis and displacement. I think that if we want there to be gains and sustainability in the long term, we can't just focus on emergencies. We need to have a more long-term perspective. Similarly, I don't think that we can only focus on one level of education or on education just as access and quality of education. We need to put everything in context and on a dynamic of resilience and self-sufficiency of girls and women in general. And this will then allow them to improve their access to education. That's a very valid point. Earlier, we were talking about the nexus between emergency and development and the long term. So I think it's really worthwhile to think about our actions in a multi-sectoral approach in order to have long-term gains. Now, perhaps we can have a quick reaction from Rachel. Rachel. Thank you very much. I've really appreciated Rachel's intervention, the other Rachel. A lot of people we're talking about here have an influence on women's education. There's a gap in scientific materials. We know that the gender division at home, whereby women should be on the domestic sphere and men in work, has really impacted on women's school career and educational career. This also has an impact on women not choosing scientific careers, but we are seeing qualitative change in this respect in many of our countries in West and Central Africa. We are seeing scientific awards aimed at girls. There's Miss Digital for Mali, and a girl has been awarded this prize. So this is national support. We've also talked about the impact of COVID-19. COVID-19 is worsening this gender division in terms of work, all the gender division that existed within our societies. Many of the girls in our communities need to have a place where they can go to escape their daily household chores and housework, but we have to ensure that school remains secure. and invest in such a way that we can preserve the dignity of girls in school, and to make sure that those gender norms are not duplicated in the educational systems. We have UNESCO and other stakeholders who are working with us on comprehensive sexuality education in schools to ensure that schools become safe spaces for girls and boys. Somebody said that we couldn't ensure equality for girls if we don't have equality for boys. We're going to create disparities if we invest more in girls and in boys, but that's not the issue. The issue is to reduce the gap, keeping the level that we have for boys, but making sure that we can fill the gap for girls in West and Central Africa. I was in a mission in Guinea, and you have to understand that in this region, girls' enrollment rate in some regions is not just 5%. In Mali and Niger and Cote d'Ivoire, in my own country, there are huge disparities in rural areas. And in West and Central Africa, rural environments account for a large part of the population. So we need to make sure that these inequalities are not replicated in the school system. We need to make sure that equality is ensured for girls as well as for boys in the environments where we have an intervention. And I'll just finish by saying that with the impact of COVID-19 and the scarcity of financial resources, it is not possible for a partner such as UNESCO, Plan International, or HCR to address alone the challenges that we're encountering in West and Central Africa. And this is why we need to complement each other in our mandate and ensure that our investments are much more supportive for the communities that we serve. And in this framework, Plan International is working with the UN organizations as well as with organizations who are working in initiatives such as Save the Children, World Vision, to ensure that the issue of protecting children's rights and girls' education becomes a reality in West and Central Africa. So I just wanted to say that we need to make sure that we invest together in a multi-sectoral approach focused on the individual, not on our mandates, but looking at development perspectives and taking into account the community in everything we do. Thank you. Thank you very much to Rachel, Charlotte, and Rachel for your perspectives and for your answers to these questions. There are many questions in the chat, so I'd just like to ask one small question before I give the floor to Nicole Gesno.
One question for you, Rachel. Isn't the issue of equal access more important than cultural change, core norm change? Rachel?
Yes, thank you. I think the two of them are very closely related because, and they kind of go one, each can support the other, because it's certainly the case that if you achieve equal access, you set up a new norm, which is that everybody attends school, and then that gets embedded, and it creates its own cultural change. On the other hand, where and one way to do that is to provide education everywhere and to make it the law. But we know even where it is the law and where there is good quality of access, still, you know, not every child attends, and there can be gender discrimination in that. On the other hand, in contexts where so that's one approach. I mean, another approach is to try to close the gap by shifting the norm to ensure that girls' education is equally valued to that of boys, or in contexts where the gap is the other way around, that boys' education is equally valued to that of girls, and to achieve that through cultural change. A third route, obviously, is to focus on the financial barriers and get equal access that way. So I guess my view is that all of those then really are routes to the same goal, which is to enable all children to get an education, and which approach is the most important will really depend on the reasons why not all children are accessing education in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Unfortunately, we cannot answer all the questions, so I have to move to our third theme. In French, sorry. Comment investir au mieux dans l'éducation?
How can we invest in the best way possible in girls' education? We've also already answered some of this question in part on the complementarity of mandates, multi-approach and multi-sectoral investment, focusing on individuals. But I would like to have the perspective of Nicole Gesneau from the Embassy of Canada in Senegal on this issue.
Et aussi compte tenu de l'expérience du Canada, du gouvernement.
Also taking into account all of the experience of the Embassy of Canada on financing education for girls. What is the perspective of Global Affairs Canada on these investments, especially on the most efficient investments that can be made in girls' education before and during crises? Nicole, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Fabrizia. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening to all. And thank you for your invitation and taking part in this panel. Now, before I start, I will answer the question, why should we invest in girls' education? We could have a seminar that would be a few days long on this topic. Just briefly, I'm not going to argue on equity issues, but on the fact that development is not going to happen by using only 50% of the forces of a country. In order for a country to move forward, all of its forces have to be mobilized. All statistics show that girls' education leads to more prosperous and more healthy communities because there's an increase in the household income, children are in better health, decreased mortality, and intergenerational challenges that tend to hinder prosperity are overcome. So when we're talking about focusing on girls or focusing on boys, I think that the debate that's not what the debate's about. It's more about equality versus equity. Some need a little bit more help than others in order for there to be equality. So when it's about jumping a barrier, you could picture it as boys only needing one box to jump over a barrier and girls needing 3 boxes to go over that barrier. So we need to provide the girls with those extra boxes. Now, on the issue of investments that has the most impact, well, you've answered the question by identifying the challenges and the responses that were brought to bear. I think that Charlotte in her intervention has made the main point that I wanted to make, so I apologize if I just repeat what's already been said. Canada's response, Canada is a donor or a financial and technical partner in girls' education following COVID-19, has been done around 3 observations. The education sector has been fragilized. Education systems were not prepared to ensure adequately the continuity of education, especially with the most marginalized populations. And sometimes there was a complete lack of infrastructure or connectivity. Then the second observation is that girls are more vulnerable to such crises as COVID-19. And then return within the educational system of girls is not just about availability of the educational supply. When a crisis exacerbates inequalities, there are social and economic impacts. So Canada's response was based on three ambitions. The first was to maintain educational achievements and girls' school success. The second was to ensure an exit for the crisis for the most vulnerable and therefore girls. And the third ambition was to build the future by continuing to ensure the progress to SDG 4 by ensuring the resilience of ministries of education and the education system. Challenges that education systems are faced with are not new, but the COVID-19 pandemic has only increased these problems. So Canada's response has focused around access to quality education for girls whilst ensuring that programming remains gender sensitive and that this remains a key issue. Support for governments and stakeholders needs to focus on inequalities between girls and boys, which takes into account regional disparities, household vulnerabilities, gender-based violence in school and out of school, disability, children's work, refugees, and IDPs. Now, for all of those who worked in humanitarian aid and in development and who have faced emergencies, well, we've realized that in crisis situations, there is a real tyranny of emergency. This tyranny of emergency often relegates the promotion of gender equality to the background because we want to act fast. We want to show that we are acting.
Avec une perspective, si on rejoint tout à coup, les femmes vont être rejointes. Mais en fait, on ne fait que
everybody joins all at once, then women will be part of that. But that actually only just replicates existing structures which don't fully benefit the women's potential and don't develop this. To ensure that responding to a crisis, it's very important to have a differentiated analysis, taking into consideration the place and the role of women and girls within the community, within the families, and in respecting their rights. So new approaches to education, we have to better take into account factors due to the crisis, and the principles and the tools developed by Canada have been fundamental to ensure that the answers to COVID integrate gender equality into account. Girls and women have to be stakeholders in determining the needs of students, in designing the tools for education, and in assessing results. And this feminist policy also applies to our domestic policies in Canada, so it's not just for abroad. You have to look at power struggles between genders and also amongst women. This is often an aspect which is forgotten because women themselves often can play a positive or a negative role in accessing education for girls. Mothers-in-law, for example. So in all projects, you have to really take the time necessary to make this differentiated analysis. And so this has been integrated into our response to the COVID. So to ensure continuity of learning, Canada has come up with innovative solutions, has also strengthened existing initiatives, initiatives such as learning through games and learning in informal contexts. And secondly, equitable and safe return to school. Canada wishes to ensure that children can go back to school without any risks for their health or for their safety, to protect all children. And then the third strand is to support fighting against systemic hurdles to education. And so this also comes back to before, during, and after a crisis. So the the Charlevoix G7 initiative. G7 reiterates its support to the sector initiatives to ensure that all children have access to quality education. This entails setting up initiatives for education and attacking the root causes of a lack of education. For a sustainable response that has to be based on initiatives outside education as well, national, community, and multi-sectorial responses in healthcare, nutrition, child protection, social and psychological support for a sustainable return of girls to school. It's necessary to look at food security, economic means, the tuition, support to families, also the increased violence, gender-based violence, early marriage, female genital mutilation. You also have to protect the rights of children and especially girls. So those are the aspects that we've focused on. So there was an emergency in education, but you also have to take the other aspects into account. So I've been talking about investments for financial projects, but you also have to, this is something that's much less talked about because it also calls upon funds from international donors and also on technical capacity. And this is policy dialogue to reinforce policies to overcome hurdles to girls' education. Internationally and nationally, Canada exerts its influence to foster education for girls, especially in times of a pandemic. So implementing our engagements, so for SDGs, especially girls' education for adolescents and women, and also reinforcing access to education. And secondly, fiscal policies to protect spending on education in the short and long term. Some countries, there have been negative effects due to budgetary adaptations to COVID, and this can have a lasting effect on the results of students in the middle and long term. Some countries, the budget for education was reduced. When 90% of these budgets go to salaries, so which does mean that there's been no investment in facilities. Also, you have to integrate gender into government responses to the pandemic. Above and beyond talk, it's also important to take into account gender integration on the ground. There's also the importance of statistical data around data for education, and the data is necessary for monitoring and evaluation of all policies set up. And those are the elements that are important to focus on. So there's a lot to be done. Bilateral donors provide important means, and there's the United Nations system. Provide expertise in the various sectors to overcome these hurdles. Many ministries of education have come up with response plans to preserve the continuity of learning, respecting equity, equality, and sustainability. But very often, when you look at the detail, they often don't take gender equity into account, and there are often differentiated impacts on boys and girls. So investment must be accompanied by advice to ministries to take gender into account in their investments. So I talked about continuity in learning. Continuity is great, This is to ensure that there's access to education and to ensure there's no gender bias. But when you look more closely, this goal of continuity can actually increase inequality between students, especially between boys and girls. Governments, for example, they have to invest in distance learning, but distance learning and mechanisms set up have actually widened some gaps in access to education, especially for the most vulnerable who have little access to digital technologies. Some students who are already in difficulty have seen these difficulties worsened because of these policies. And also there's the fact that sometimes the school hours conflict with household chores. And these are the type of stakes that really need to be taken into account if we want to overcome these gaps. Opening schools back up, infrastructure and school equipment to meet current standards can be an opportunity to adapt this infrastructure to the needs of girls. For example, hygienic products. And on the subject of reopening schools, there are directives for school principals, for the reorganization of class times, and if needed, through reworking school hours, etc., and taking into account specific needs, namely of girls. So the multi-sectoral approach, looking at education, is determining for access to education. To conclude, investments which will have the most impact on the education of girls and access to quality and inclusive education have to accompany stakeholders in their planning phases. And the girls have to be considered as stakeholders and not just beneficiaries of these programs. And support for education systems must take into account not schools actually, but the students themselves, to set up investments which fight against systemic hurdles, take into account economic and social and cultural hurdles, as well as aspects to do with education, hygiene, and healthcare. We need innovative strategies to help girls and those most marginalized to improve their education, investments to ensure a safe and fair return to school, investments which also take into account sectorial hurdles which have been worsened by the pandemic, investments which strengthen resilience of the educational systems and which support the systems, the materials, training for teachers, and to continue strengthening development and make aid more effective. We have to continue doing what we're already doing, but also improve it. And even if we've said a lot about the negative impact on girls of the pandemic, it is also an opportunity to really look at matters differently. Nobody can say that tomorrow is going to be the same as yesterday. A lot of things have changed, and we really have to draw lessons from this pandemic and our responses to the pandemic, and see this as an opportunity to build back better. And so these are opportunities that we really have to grasp. Thank you for listening, and I'm here for any questions. Thank you very much, Nicole, for your very interesting presentation and for highlighting the necessity of having a contextualized approach and reinforcing the fact that we mustn't work in silos. We really have to pool our resources and our efforts. You talked about mobilizing resources and technical capacity. This means a lot to me because at the International Institute for Educational Planning, this is our mandate. It's to provide support for the UNESCO member states in managing and planning their educational systems. We talked about policy dialogue at various levels, internationally and nationally. And I think we really got a glimpse of
des investissements les plus importants, on va dire,
the most important investments.
Du point de vue du Canada, tu l'as dit tout à l'heure.
At least from Canada's perspective, you've set up innovative strategies to help the most marginalized. You also talked about how you managed and provided assistance for a healthy return to school, healthy and safe, especially for girls. You also mentioned something that's fundamental that was already raised earlier, but seen from the perspective of a donor, which is the importance of taking all sectors into account. It really has to, the multi-sectorial approach which is needed to overcome the hurdles which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. You also talked about the necessity to build more resilient educational systems. And also the need to invest in technologies.
Donc, il y a une... Et d'ailleurs, il y a un auditeur qui suggère que...
And one of the listeners has suggested that maybe for our next session, we should...
Donc, based on what we've said. Et donc, il y a peut-être une question pour toi, Nicole, qui est...
So a question perhaps for you, Nicole.
That are the problem. Even before COVID, they were too low and poorly distributed. Donc, peut-être un commentaire sous forme de question. Donc, pas assez c'est le gros problème, c'est le budget.
So the main problem is the budget. What can the Canadian government say on this subject, and also the other partners? Maybe Plan International or UNHCR?
Okay, yes, well, it's a good question. I guess it's deal with the national budget rather than aid budget. Because in our response, what we looked at is how we can best respond. So we had access to COVID fund and realignment of existing funds. So at the national level with our partner countries, budget tend to be, education sector tend to be underfunded. That's one issue, even though it's often identified as a key element for economic growth. It's also an issue of the structure of the education budget. 80% is often, about 80% is for paying salaries, so it leaves very little in terms of investment, and these 20% tend to be in fact funded by donors. So it's yes, it's a question of more resources, but it's also a question of governance. And it's also a question of the quality of the services which are being provided. So that puts into question the curriculum, the recruitment and the training of teachers. Recruiting more teachers, yes, I mean, there are a number of countries where there are not enough teachers, or there are not enough teachers in remote areas. When we talk about science, in some region of Senegal, there are no teachers for science matters. But recruiting more teachers, if they are not better trained, if they cannot work within streamlined processes, if they're not equipped in terms of dealing with child protection, dealing with gender issues, then we won't be moving forward. And I think what's needed is really to take a hard look at the resources, streamline them, reorient them, and ensure that the quality resources beyond the financial resources are in place. So that's what I would answer to that question.
Merci Nicole, c'est très.
Thank you, Nicole. Very clear and informative.
I really want to thank everyone for the many links and to relevant works and studies and examples that people have posted in the chat. This is really helpful for us to really enrich and continue the reflection around girls' education during COVID and after COVID. For example, we have the work of CG Dev. We have also the work of ILO, so that we will take all these resources and we will share them. So thank you very much. Merci Nicole pour cette.
Thank you, Nicole, for your response on budgets and the necessity to have the right structures in place, also the importance of governance and the quality of service. We still have time for one or two questions, but we are reaching the end of our very rich debate, I must confess.
Une question qu'on n'a pas pu répondre, à laquelle on n'a pas pu répondre tout à l'heure, que je prends.
There's one question we haven't been able to answer earlier.
Voilà, une question très pratique qui reste dans le chat.
It's a very pragmatic question. How can a teacher take into account the gender dimension in their teaching in a very practical way? Maybe that's a question for Rachel. How can a teacher take into account the gender dimension in his teaching? Thank you very much. Well, that's a very practical question, and I think this will be the last time I take the floor. So I wanted to mention what Nicole was saying about financing. PLA International has received a lot of funding through the Federation. Education does remain an underfunded sector. After COVID-19, emergency plans remained underfunded. We've received funding from NORAD, IRISCO, Education Cannot Wait, UNICEF, GPE, GCE, etc. So all of these partners have funded the initiatives that PLA International is setting up for the communities in West and Central Africa. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them and tell them that the investments that are being made are bearing fruit, because we are making sure that the impact of COVID-19 is minimized on anything to do with girls' education and more generally on gender disparities that we are observing in this important region of the world. Now, to return to your question, Fabrizia, about how gender can be integrated, I'll give you an example of 10, 15 years ago with somebody you might know, Dr. Tehez Lopo. This was one of my first interventions in the area of gender. So we'd started to look at school handbooks. My personal experience is that school handbooks in Côte d'Ivoire always shows the girl washing plates with her mum and the little boy going to the field with her dad. And that really annoyed me. I was wondering why some jobs that are income generating for the future are always aimed at the boy, but domestic work is always meant to be for girls. And so Tehez Loco set up this research group, which I took part in, to get us to think about how we could make the school system more gender sensitive. There was a lot of investment in this sector, And that was 10, 15 years ago, and this has really had an impact. So the teacher needs to be mindful of these details. These are details, but they're very important because it all starts with school textbooks, through the language he uses, if he says he or she. It all starts with how values are internalized, how he manages to get egalitarian values to be internalized. And it all starts with the teacher, how he reflects that when he's teaching the children. So I think there are lots of concepts that start with the teacher, how he considers him or herself, how he has an impact on the teacher, how he conveys values, taking into account his own gender norms. You have to take this into account because all of this can interact on the way in which the teacher dispenses his teaching. So there are a lot of questions that could lead us to 2 or 3 days discussions. We could still be talking about this for many days. So I'd really like to thank the audience for the quality of the questions, which lead us to really try to challenge ourselves in the responses that we give. Yes, indeed, Rachel. It's fascinating, and we're coming to the end of our webinar, unfortunately. So I just wanted to give all of our speakers an opportunity to say one last word. So Rachel, Marcus perhaps can say one word by way of conclusion, or each of you can give just a couple of words to before we close and before we turn over.
Thank you, Fabricia. I just wanted to follow on those excellent suggestions that Rachel made in her intervention, and also to highlight the work on gender responsive pedagogy that organizations like Farway are doing to institutionalize training of teachers, both before they become teachers and teachers in service. To reflect on their own gender norms and to teach in gender sensitive ways. I think it's hugely important, and it's the kind of thing that may start to seem like a luxury as we respond to the pandemic, but it definitely should not be forgotten in the quest to make sure that we make up for learning loss and getting back into school children who are missing out. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. Also, UNESCO also organizes also gender responsive pedagogy, so we could also go to UNESCO's website as well. Thank you, Rachel, and really thank you for your availability today. Nicole, un mot de la fin?
Oui, merci. Je pense que ce qui est toujours difficile.
Thank you. I think what's always tricky in crisis situations and in development in general is to go the last mile. And girls are the last mile. All studies and experiences show that when you can go the last mile, everyone benefits because systems become more resilient and better serve the entire population. So this is really what we have to aim for. When we talk about the last mile, it's different from saying we need to connect with the whole population, because we do it differently, we do it using different methods, and therefore it's much more inclusive. And of course, it won't all happen in a day, because there's issues with system governance, and here governments really have to give absolute priority to these issues. Governments have to take ownership. We're just here to support them. We can't do the work for them. And thank you for having given me this occasion to speak here. Now, Charlotte, just for one final word.
Nicole vient de dire,
to react to
de la gouvernance,
what Nicole has just said, I think that the issue of governance is indeed key. Earlier, Rachel said you can't do everything alone. We talked about breaking down silos, and I think that's also valid.
L'éducation des filles.
For saying, oh, refugee education is the HCR, UNGAI deals with girls' education. No, I think it's really important to strengthen the collaboration of all stakeholders.
Il y a que par là qu'on pourra aussi
ownership is the only way that we can improve country governance. And to talk about inclusion in general, whether it's gender equity or the inclusion of displaced population or refugee populations or other people affected by crises and conflict, I think there really needs to be awareness, and that the development of sector plan needs to take these issues seriously so that there's a real difference on the long term and in terms of action. Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlotte. In terms of education sector plan, well, I coordinate the Gender at the Center initiative with UNGAI and partners such as Plan International, UNICEF, GPE. And this is really at the very heart of our interventions. We want to put gender at the center of education systems, including education sector analysis and education sector plan. So thank you so much to all of you for your very rich perspectives, your expertise. We are coming to the end of this meeting, of this webinar.
Il y a un commentaire que je voulais juste pour vous partager.
There's just one comment I wanted to share with
Men are also part of the solution. Malheureusement, on avait un male panelist qui n'a pas.
Unfortunately, we did have a male panelist, but he wasn't able to join us because he had connection issues. But of course, boys and men are part of the solution as well. We talked about masculinities, we talked about intersectional issues, we talked about everything to do with, we talked with gender norms. And of course, when we talk about gender norms, we're not just talking about girls' education, we're not just talking about the impact that this has on girls. So thank you so much for this comment. Thank you so much to all of you for making yourselves available for this very rich 2-hour debate. Let's carry on putting gender at the center of our interventions, at the heart of education and education systems. Take care of yourselves, and I hope to see you very soon for other online conferences, but more than anything, I hope that we will be able to see each other live and face to face. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Merci.